Saigon, late in 1945, the air still thick with the smell of aviation fuel and monsoon rot, and a French mechanic named Lucien stood on the cracked concrete of Tan Son Nhut airfield, staring at something that should not have existed in his war anymore. 13 fighters sat in a crooked line, their fuselages painted with hasty French roundels over paint that had, only months before, worn the red disc of Imperial Japan. They were Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusas, the aircraft the Allies had nicknamed Oscar, the plane that had chased British Buffaloes out of Malayan skies and humiliated American Warhawks over Burma. Now they belonged to France, or what passed for France in a colony unravelling in real time. And Lucien's orders were simple and absurd: get them flying because there was nothing else to fly. He had trained on nothing like this. No manual in French existed. The instruments were labelled in Japanese script that none of the ground crew could read, and half the men signing off on maintenance sheets were doing so on guesswork and prayer. And yet within weeks, those 13 aircraft would be strafing Viet Minh positions along the Mekong Delta, flown by French pilots who, only months earlier, had been trained to shoot Ki-43s down, not climb into their cockpits. That single image, a French airman entrusting his life to the very machine his air force had spent years learning to fear, is the door into a stranger, a more revealing story than it first appears. Because this is not really a story about 13 borrowed fighters limping through a forgotten colonial air war. It is a story about what happens when an empire runs out of everything except desperation, and about the strange logic of post-war Europe, where yesterday's enemy hardware becomes tomorrow's only available answer. It is a story about the gap between what a modern air force believes it needs and what a broke, exhausted, half-rebuilt nation can actually put into the sky. To understand why French pilots ended up in Japanese cockpits, you have to understand the particular kind of ruin France was flying out of in 1945. Its air force had been shattered twice. First in the catastrophic collapse of 1940, then in the slow bleeding of resources under occupation and Vichy neglect. By the time Paris was liberated, France did not have a modern aviation industry so much as the scattered bones of one. Factories retooled for German war production, engineers who had spent 4 years building parts for the Luftwaffe, a pilot corps split between men who had flown for the Free French in borrowed British and American aircraft, and men who had spent the war grounded, watching from the sidelines of a conflict fought without them. And then, almost overnight, France discovered it had an empire to hold together with an air force that barely existed. Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia had been under nominal Vichy French administration throughout most of the war, propped up by an uneasy arrangement with occupying Japanese forces who left the colonial bureaucracy in place while quietly running the show behind it. That arrangement collapsed in March 1945, when Japan, sensing the war was lost and fearing French treachery, moved to crush French colonial authority outright in a swift coup. French garrisons were disarmed, officers executed or interned, and for a few months, Japan ruled Indochina directly through a puppet Vietnamese government. Then in August, Japan surrendered, and into the vacuum stepped a movement that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Viet Minh, under Ho Chi Minh, declaring independence within days of the Japanese collapse. France, humiliated twice over, first defeated in Europe, then swept aside in its own colony, now faced the question of whether it could reassert control over Indochina at all, and to do that, it needed aircraft, immediately. In a theatre 8,000 miles from home, with no functioning supply chain, no spare parts pipeline, and precious few modern fighters to spare from a rebuilding metropolitan air force that needed everything it had for itself. This was the belief the Viet Minh, and frankly, most rational observers held in late 1945, that French air power in Indochina, if it existed at all, would be negligible. Britain and France had exhausted their aircraft reserves fighting a continental war. The Americans, flush with surplus, were hardly going to hand modern P-47s to a colonial power trying to reassert an empire that Franklin Roosevelt himself had publicly questioned the legitimacy of. Any Vietnamese nationalist watching French transport ships arrive in Saigon harbour in the autumn of 1945 had every reason to assume the French would be fighting this war with rifles, trucks and whatever obsolete relics they could scrounge, not with functioning fighter squadrons capable of contesting the sky. That assumption was not unreasonable. It was, for a few crucial months, almost entirely correct. And then it stopped being correct, because of a piece of institutional improvisation nobody had planned for, and few outsiders would have predicted. France began flying the very aircraft Japan had left behind. When the Japanese garrison in Indochina surrendered in September 1945, they did not simply vanish. Under the terms worked out between Allied occupation authorities and Japanese commanders, complicated further by the peculiar British-led occupation of southern Indochina that briefly preceded full French return, Japanese military equipment across the region was surrendered largely intact. Airfields, workshops, fuel stores, spare parts depots, and aircraft. Dozens of them, including a batch of Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters that had been based in the region flying reconnaissance and light strike missions in the war's final year. Most Allied powers treated captured Japanese aircraft the way you'd expect, as curiosities, as intelligence assets, to be shipped home and picked apart by engineers hungry to understand what they'd been fighting. Some were destroyed outright as a matter of policy, denying any residual capability to local forces. But France, staring at an air power vacuum it could not fill any other way, made a different calculation. 13 of those Ki-43s, judged airworthy or close to it, were absorbed into French colonial air units, rather than scrapped or shipped away. It was not glamorous. It was not a masterstroke of doctrine. It was, in the truest sense, an engineering culture built on scarcity, finding a use for whatever sat on the runway. This is where the story usually gets told wrong, or told too simply, as though a captured aircraft is a captured aircraft, and flying one is merely a matter of painting new markings on the fuselage and taking off. The reality was closer to controlled chaos. French ground crews, many of them colonial mechanics with limited formal training, had to reverse engineer maintenance procedures for an airframe built to standards, tolerances, and materials entirely foreign to French aviation practice. Fuel mixtures had to be worked out by trial, hydraulic fluids substituted, instrument panels partially relabeled by hand, sometimes with grease pencil directly on the glass. There was no factory support, no manufacturer liaison, no shipment of replacement parts from Nakajima's assembly lines, because Nakajima's assembly lines were rubble and its home country was under Allied occupation. And yet the Ki-43 itself was, mechanically, a gift to men in this position. It was a light, simple, forgiving aircraft, designed by Japanese engineers around a doctrine that prized maneuverability and pilot visibility over armour or raw horsepower. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks in most variants, lacked heavy armament by Western standards, and would have been outclassed by any serious contemporary fighter. But none of that mattered in Indochina in late 1945, because the Ki-43 had no serious contemporary fighter to face. It only had to be better than nothing, easier to fly than complex Western liaison aircraft nobody had enough of, and simple enough that a mechanic with limited spares and no factory support could keep 3 or 4 of them airworthy on any given week. In a theatre where French air assets numbered in the low dozens, an aircraft that was flyable beat an aircraft that was theoretically superior but grounded. This is the part of the story that rarely gets its due weight. France's advantage in this narrow, strange chapter of the Indochina conflict was not superior technology. It was the opposite. It was the willingness to fly technologically compromised, orphaned machinery, because the alternative was flying nothing at all. The real French advantage was institutional flexibility under scarcity, a colonial air command willing to improvise doctrine, training, and maintenance around aircraft that no manual, no doctrine, and no prior French training pipeline had ever prepared them for. The pilots who flew them were themselves a study in improvisation. Some were veteran French airmen who had cut their teeth in the Free French Air Forces flying Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts over Europe, now finding themselves strapped into a lighter, twitchier airframe with a canopy view and control feel utterly unlike anything in their combat experience. Others were younger pilots rushed through abbreviated conversion training, essentially learning an enemy aircraft's handling characteristics through trial, error, and the patient coaching of whichever senior pilot had managed to get a few hours in the cockpit first. There was no operational manual translated into French in those early weeks. Pilots briefed each other verbally after landing, comparing notes on stall behaviour, on how the aircraft handled in the thick, humid Indo-Chinese air, on how the guns, often a mix of Japanese calibers that French armourers had to source ammunition for through captured stockpiles, behaved in sustained fire. Through the early months of 1946, as the fragile peace between France and the Viet Minh curdled into open conflict, those 13 Ki-43s were pressed into a role their designers in Tokyo could never have imagined, flying under a French tricolour, strafing and reconnaissance sweeping Viet Minh positions and river traffic across the Mekong Delta and the approaches to Saigon. They were not decisive weapons. They were not going to win a war by themselves, and no serious account of the early Indochina conflict would claim they did. But they were present at a moment when presence itself was the entire point. Every sortie those aircraft flew was proof, visible from the ground to Vietnamese fighters who had spent years watching Japanese aircraft rule the sky. That French air power, however patched together, however borrowed, however absurd its provenance, had returned and intended to stay. There is a particular kind of psychological weight in that. Imagine a Viet Minh unit moving supplies along a delta waterway at dawn, hearing the unmistakable engine note of a radial engine fighter approaching low over the paddies, and looking up to see not a French aircraft in any conventional sense, but the same silhouette that had haunted the skies over Rangoon and Singapore only a year or two before. The confusion in that moment was not tactical, it was almost existential. The empire that had just been driven out was gone, and yet its machines were still in the air, now flown by the other empire that had just returned to reclaim what it considered its own. For a movement built on the promise that colonial power was finished, permanently and irreversibly, the sight of a captured Japanese fighter flying French colours was an uncomfortable, disorienting contradiction, proof that history does not clear the board and start fresh, it simply hands the same pieces to new players. But if the Ki-43s bought France a fragile early presence in Indo-Chinese skies, they could not buy France sustainability, and this is where the deeper structural truth of the story reveals itself, because the very thing that made the Ki-43 usable in the first place, its simplicity, its availability, its status as scavenged wartime debris, was also the thing guaranteeing its short service life. Every hour those aircraft flew ate into a finite, irreplaceable stock of parts that no factory anywhere on Earth was still producing. There was no supply chain to replenish worn piston rings, no source for replacement propeller blades, no pipeline of Japanese manufactured components, because Japan's own aviation industry had been dismantled by Allied occupation authorities determined to ensure it could never rearm. Every cannibalized part taken from one grounded Ki-43 to keep another flying was a small, irreversible subtraction from a total that could only shrink. By 1947, the arithmetic had become unforgiving. Airframes that had flown dozens of sorties in the chaotic first year of the war were increasingly grounded for want of parts that simply did not exist anymore. French Colonial Air Command, meanwhile, was finally receiving what it had lacked from the start. Real supply lines from metropolitan France and from American surplus stocks, delivering more conventional aircraft, more spare parts, more standardized maintenance training. The KY-43s, which had been an ingenious stopgap born of desperation, became a liability the moment desperation eased even slightly. An aircraft that cannot be resupplied is not an asset. It is a countdown. One by one across 1946 and into 1947, the 13 Hayabusas were withdrawn from active flying status. Some were stripped for parts to keep the last few flyable a little longer, in the same cannibalizing logic that had governed their entire operational life. Others simply sat, engines seized or airframes deemed unsafe, on the margins of airfields that had more urgent uses for their ramp space. There was no dramatic final mission, no last stand worthy of its own chapter. The end came the way most equipment obsolescence comes, quietly, administratively, one grounding order at a time, until a fleet that had briefly represented the entire visible presence of French air power in Indochina had been reduced to a handful of derelict hulks awaiting scrapping. By the time French air units in Indochina were operating a more conventional mix of American and French-built aircraft, the Ki-43s that had once been essential were simply gone from the order of battle, quietly struck off strength, their airframes broken up or left to rot in the tropical heat that had never stopped working against them. So what actually happened to those 13 fighters, and what does their brief, strange service really tell us? The direct answer is unglamorous. They were flown hard for roughly a year to 18 months, under conditions their designers never intended, kept airworthy through improvisation rather than infrastructure, and then consumed by the same scarcity that had brought them into French service in the first place, cannibalized, grounded, and scrapped, once genuine supply lines made them unnecessary and unsustainable. But the wider answer is more interesting than the fate of 13 airframes. It is about what post-war empires actually look like up close, stripped of the tidy narratives told afterward. France did not return to Indochina in 1945 as a resurgent power projecting overwhelming force. It returned improvising, scavenging, flying its enemy's cast-off machinery because it had nothing else, and it made that improvisation work just long enough to matter. The story of the Ki-43s in French hands is really the story of colonial power in its most exposed, least mythologized form. Not confident, not inevitable, but held together by mechanics working without manuals, pilots learning enemy aircraft on the fly, and a command structure willing to use whatever sat on the tarmac, rather than admit it had nothing to fly at all. There is a cost worth naming here too, even if it is easy to overlook amid the strangeness of the aircraft themselves. Every sortie those Ki-43s flew was a combat mission against Vietnamese fighters, and inevitably against Vietnamese civilians, caught along contested waterways and villages, in a war that would grow into one of the 20th century's longest and bloodiest anti-colonial struggles. The mechanics who kept them flying and the pilots who flew them were, in their own telling, simply doing a job under impossible conditions. But the aircraft they nursed into the sky helped hold open a colonial war that would eventually cost hundreds of thousands of lives and would not end for France until a catastrophic defeat at Dien Bien Phu nearly a decade later. 13 borrowed fighters did not cause that war, but they were among its first quiet instruments, evidence that France's return to Indochina began not with strength, but with the uneasy, improvised use of the enemy's own wreckage. What remains of them now is almost nothing. No preserved airframe, no museum piece marking this particular chapter, just scattered references in unit records and the memories of men long since gone. 13 aircraft, built in Japan to hunt Allied pilots over Burma and Malaya, ended their working lives strafing rice paddies for an empire that had itself just been humiliated, before being quietly broken apart for parts and left to rust. It is a small story inside a much larger one, but it says something true and uncomfortable about how empires actually rebuild themselves after catastrophe, not with clean new machines and confident doctrine, but with whatever wreckage happens to be lying on the runway, and the desperate, resourceful men willing to fly it.